Another genre of Jewish humor is the trickster. When you think of him, you also think of Herschel Astropolya,
right,
and certain
Chabad.
tricksters who are, sort of on the lower level of society, and that gives them the freedom to do things that other people wouldn't.
Right, that's true. He doesn't owe anything to anyone, so he kind of gets to say what he wants.
And the Sephardic people have their own Herschel Astropolya,
right,
which is related to the Turkish trickster. I mean, the trickster humor is something that goes around.
Right.
In Eastern Europe, I think those jokes are different than the Jewish jokes that were told in America. They're sort of, the power dynamics changes in the United States.
Right, yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting aspects of Jewish humor in the United States is there's sort of a bourgeois component. The Jews became middle class here faster than they did anywhere else. And so you wind up with jokes, and it's one of these jokes that Jews tell each other about the grandmother that's on the beach in Miami with her grandson, and he's scooped up by a wave and swept into the ocean. The grandmother says, God, please send my child back. I'll do anything. I'll go to shul every Saturday, and I'll give to the yeshiva. Suddenly he whooshes back up onto the shore, and the grandmother looks up at this guy, and she says, he had a hat. It's this sort of sense of entitlement, right, in a way you might not have had elsewhere.
Right. And there's the one about the rabbi, the cantor, and the janitor hanging out after services.
I don't know that one.
I guess let's call it Temple Emmanuel in New York, right? And it's like, here I am, the richest synagogue in New York, but in the eyes of God, I'm nothing. And the cantor says, here I am, the cantor in the greatest synagogue in New York. In the eyes of God, I'm nothing. And the janitor looks up and says, here I am, janitor in the richest synagogue in New York, but in the eyes of God, I'm nothing. And the rabbi pokes the cantor. Look who thinks he's nothing. I find the American jokes Jews have much more confidence.
Right, yeah, absolutely. There's no question. Their position in society is so different than it was in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union.
Now I also see you have a book here of Orthodox.
Right.
But from the religious world.
This was written by a rabbi, and there are actually a number of joke books, almost a surfeit of joke books written by rabbis. Really, sort of interesting phenomenon. And these are all jokes. They collect snappy sayings of religious sages, I guess you could say. Others are funny stories that have to do with religious life. Every segment of Jewish society has their own jokes because print culture was so important. This was the way that it was disseminated.
Well, I mean, and it gets back to, we were talking about folk narratives. I mean, if you're observant, you have to balance entertainment with ethic, with the moral. I mean, you can't just tell jokes for no reason coming from the traditional world. I would imagine that lexicon von Yiddische Chochmes, the lexicon of Jewish jokes, would have to have that balance as well.
It does, yeah.
And he's a rabbi who put it out.
Right, they generally do. These rabbinical joke books the jokes are often called the charifis, spicy sayings that you wouldn't have elsewhere.
So maybe we could just go to these objects that you brought and give us a little more detail.
Yeah.
So we have a sort of a literary reworking of the Chelmer stories by Yud Yud Trunk.
The titles are, vary. This is Chelmer Chachom im Oder, Jeden von der klügsten Stadt in der Welt. The wise men of Chelm, or Jews from the smartest city in the world. Obviously all this is done ironically.
Right. Do we know when were the first Chelm jokes told or collected?
The first Yiddish translation of the Schildberg stories takes place in the 17th century.
Right.
The original Chelm stories, stories that are specifically to Chelm.
And not just translations of Schildberg.
Right. I don't think it happens until late 19th century, the second half of the 19th century at least. This one, for example, a shofar in Chelm. One day a stranger arrived in Chelm, a very muddy town, and lost one of his boots in the mud. He looked everywhere, but he couldn't find it. Later a Chelmite found it, but since no one in Chelm wore boots, people didn't know what it was, so they took the boot to the rabbi and a meeting was called. Everyone looked at the boot, and the rabbi declared that it was a shofar, a ram's horn, because a shofar is long at the bottom and round at the top. So the Chelmites placed the boot inside the Aron Kodesh, the Holy Ark, in the synagogue. It happened that the same stranger came back to Chelm and went to the synagogue to pray. When he saw his boot in the Holy Ark, he cried, "That's my boot, let me have it." But the Chelmites wouldn't believe him. They shouted that it wasn't a boot, it was a shofar. Well, they took the quarrel to the rabbi, who ruled that the boot was a shofar, but that the stranger should be paid 18 zlotys just the same for his distress. And that's what was done. The stranger was paid 18 zlotys, and Chelm blows the shofar with a boot. It's this town of Jewish imbeciles who have this very distinct imbecilic logic that they abide by. And everything, functions according to that. I mean, there's the story of the Chelmite who goes to the rabbi and says, what's more important, the sun or the moon? And the rabbi says, well, of course the moon, because it's there at night when we need it. The sun is there during the day when it's light.
There's actually an element of absurdity that we haven't even talked about, the sort of absurd jokes.
Right.
Which is what makes it funny.
Right, exactly. It's almost like logic and naivete taken to an extreme.